May the Lord give you peace. Welcome back. We're starting class number 5, and we're talking about, in this class, the history of Assisi. It's important to study the history of Assisi and also the culture that surrounded the life of St. Francis if we're going to know St. Francis. If you want to know me, you're going to have to know something about New York and the area I grew up in. You'll have to know something about Brooklyn. I wasn't raised in Brooklyn, but I was raised by Brooklyn. My father speaks Brooklynese. And that goes into my person, how I respond to things, the way I speak, the manner in which I say it, my thought process. A lot of it goes to the culture where I grew up and what surrounded me as a person maturing and growing up in the 1980s out in New York. And so if we're going to understand St. Francis, it's the same thing. We need to know the history of Assisi. We need to know the culture surrounding him, because all that goes into forming his person, as we'll see as we go through the notes here. And so the history of the city of Assisi. It's one of the oldest towns in Italy, and more than likely it predates Rome. It was a city-state of the Umbrians. Its government was headed by a priestly college. And again, we're talking about before Christ. We're talking BC. If Rome is 200 years before Christ, well, this is before that. And so paganism was rich in that area, and there was a class of pagan priests who were running the city of Assisi. And they were allied in a subordinate way to the neighboring Etruscan town of Perugia. And Perugia and Assisi will be fighting enemies for centuries. And so this battle that we have between Perugia and Assisi that we see during the life of St. Francis is something that is ancient of days. It goes way back, that rivalry between the two. Assisi and Perugia fell to Rome in 295 BC at the Battle of Centino. And so they became then underneath Rome. Towns or cities that were under the control of Rome itself and became part of the Roman Empire in 295 BC. Now, Assisi became a flourishing Roman municipality of the Sergia tribe. The city was first evangelized by St. Cristobal, a disciple of St. Peter, who was sent by St. Peter to Assisi to evangelize. So you got to think that the city of Assisi goes way back. Its conversion to the faith begins to happen immediately during the life of St. Peter. So we're talking the early year 60, first century, to the middle at the end of the first century. Assisi is already being evangelized. Now we think about St. Francis and his devotion to St. Peter and St. Paul. We see that it has roots in the evangelization of the city itself by St. Cristobal, who was sent by St. Peter to evangelize Assisi. The first bishop of Assisi is St. Rufinus. Rufinus, or Rufino, for whom Brother Rufino is named after, was martyred. He was first buried in the Temple of Diana and then moved inside the city in the year 412. So Bishop of Assisi, Rufino, he refused to sacrifice to the Roman gods. And after being cruelly tortured, he was thrown into a fire from which he came out unharmed. Eventually, they tied a stone around his neck and they drowned him. And so that was the martyrdom of St. Rufino. Now, St. Sabinus, he established the first bishop's house in Assisi in the 4th century on the site of the Temple of Janus. Remember Janus, or January, as we're used to hearing the name. Janus was the first indigenous god of the pagan Romans. And so, you have St. Cristobal, St. Rufino, and other evangelists coming to Assisi to try to convert it. But like most of the area, it wasn't converted until the 4th century. And so Assisi becomes a truly Catholic town in the 4th century when St. Sabinus established the first bishop's house and took for himself the Temple of Janus. Now that was a way of showing that the Catholic Church was now crushing Janus and the old pagan religion, that it had been conquered. The second bishop of Assisi was St. Victorinus. Then we're going back again after Rufinus. So St. Victorinus was beheaded in the year 1000. His body was moved to St. Peter's inside the walls of the city. That's significant. particularly for the life of St. Francis. When St. Francis begins his rebuilding project of churches, he begins to rebuild the Church of St. Peter's. Inside the Church of St. Peter's is buried the second bishop of Assisi, who was martyred, St. Victorinus. And we think about how St. Francis loved martyrdom. And you think about, the two first bishops of Assisi being martyred in Assisi, how that would have played into his own spirituality. Okay? In the year 476 AD, so we're going ahead now, Assisi came under the control of the Byzantine Empire, same year as the fall of the Roman Empire. So as the Roman Empire was falling, the Byzantine Empire was coming through Italy, and Assisi fell underneath the control of the Byzantine Empire. Now, I point this out because it's, kind of strange that when you go to San Damiano's, you have this icon cross. And one thing about early Romanesque, spirituality, you didn't find many icons. It's not particularly a Western church devotion. It mostly goes to the Eastern church. So you have to wonder, where did the San Damiano cross come from, this icon cross? Could it have come into Assisi at the time of the Byzantine Empire's control over Assisi? There's no real history on that cross, but I put that out there as a possibility that the San Damiano cross is of Byzantine origin and came during this time of the conquest of Assisi by the Byzantines. Maybe some scholars out there will give me an email and let me know if there's a deeper history to the San Damiano cross that I'm not catching, or if it doesn't match Byzantine art. But anyway, I put it out there as a possibility. In 480 AD, Assisi became part of the kingdom of the Ostrogoths. At first, the Goths were in league with the Byzantine. Then they were opposed, and they took over all of Italy. Emperor Justinian sent troops under Belisarius to take Italy from the Goths. Assisi was a stronghold of the Byzantines. In 541 AD, the Goth king Totila began a campaign to take back the Umbrian territory. Susifrido was a Goth in Justinian's service. He was named the Duke of Assisi. The city was under his rule. He held the city through a long siege by Totila's army. When he rashly ran out to protect the fields, he left the city walls unguarded. Susifrido was killed and the city fell to the Goths in the year 545. And so we see now the Goth influence. We had the ancient Roman influence, and then we had the Byzantine influence, and now we have the Goth influence on the city of Assisi. From 568, Assisi, probably, we think, became part of the powerful Lombardian Duchy of Spoleto. And so, again, changing hands. Now let's jump ahead a few hundred years. Now remember, for us, time flies by quick, but not back then. A couple hundred years is not too long of a time for ancient history. So the fall of 773 AD, or 774, when Charlemagne was marching to Rome to be crowned the king of the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, he ordered Assisi destroyed. And no reasons given. He ordered Assisi destroyed. Many Assisi inhabitants were killed when this took place. April 6th, 774, Charlemagne renewed an earlier donation of the lands to the Pope. And this gift included the Duchy of Spoleto, a part of which was Assisi. So Assisi was given by Charlemagne to the Pope as a gift after he had destroyed it, So the Charlemagne ordered Assisi to be rebuilt. So that was nice of him. After destroying it, he orders it to be rebuilt and makes it a gift to the Pope. At least he fixed it up before returning it. Okay. Now the papal authority over the duchy was not gotten until centuries later. And so we see the history of Assisi, of a land, of a city being conquered, but there's a rebellious nature to these people. They seem to fight pretty hard. I'm not sure why Charlemagne had it destroyed. Perhaps it was because the people of Assisi were fighting back or didn't like the fact that he was coming in to be king. Who knows? But it does add to their rebellious nature, which we'll see, as we talk about Francis's own life, as they were rebelling against the lords. Now let's look at the first millennium, okay? In the first millennium, feudalism was in full swing. There were castles on every hill and every mountain. There were 22 castles in the vicinity of Assisi. 22 castles. The world was divided into two parts. The feudal nobility, the warrior class, which looked upon the emperor as their head, and then the subject peoples, the serfs, who were enslaved descendants of Italian people, or the Aldi, which were semi-free serfs, often prisoners of war, and they became peasants attached to the land. And there was constant fighting among the nobility, between the nobility. And the church had to gain control of it. Yeah, there's one noble fighting this noble, you have this king fighting this king, this castle against this castle. Is constant upheaval during this time. So the church wanted to get some control over all this fighting, to end all this fighting. In 1103 AD, a law was passed in Assisi. This is kind of funny. There was no fighting between Wednesday and Sunday. So if you're going to do your fighting, you can only fight on Monday and Tuesday. You couldn't fight between Wednesday and Sunday. There were off-limit days. You had 2 days of the week to fight, 5 days to rest. And so it limited all of the battles to 2 days of the week, you know. During the Carolingian epoch, poetry was well known in Assisi. Medieval stories of chivalry and Assisian knights at the Crusades all became part of the culture. The story of the Knights of the Round Table became very popular. We know St. Francis loved these stories. He loved this poetry and so forth. He even talked about the first friars being the Knights of the Round Table. This was really into his whole mentality, this thought process of knights and lords and so forth, you know, and it worked into his spirituality too. So this all became part of the romanticism of St. Francis. By the 12th century, the Bishop of Assisi became owner of half the property in the commune of Assisi. So the Bishop of Assisi is a very, very wealthy man. He's a lord. He's a feudal lord, basically. Bishop Guido, who cares for Francis, takes care of Francis, promotes Francis to the Holy Father. Bishop Guido is the strongest and richest feudal lord in the area. Important to note. So now the serfs, they gave way to the merchant class in the 12th and 13th century. You had this growing up of these merchants, these traders, who, not trader in the sense of trade, being traders to their country, who were trading things, And so due to the violence of centuries, the free farmers had to sell their lands to feudal lords for protection. In doing so, they would lose all their rights. They could be freed, but it was done in a particular ceremony. Now the merchant class arose. There was great trade by land and sea. Gather in the markets to buy and to sell. Particularly in Assisi, you had the Piazza Minerva, where there was that, to this day it's there. There's the old temple to the goddess Minerva right there in the piazza, and that became a great place of a market. By the way, that temple is now called Santa Maria sopra Minerva, Holy Mary above Minerva. So you kind of get the image of Our Lady crushing Minerva beneath her, because now what was the Temple of Minerva is now a Catholic church. But this was this in front of Santa Maria sopra Minerva. There was a whole market in the center town of Assisi, and there was this new money-based system replacing bartering. So the merchants were becoming wealthy, very wealthy. By 1203, the merchants were equal to the lords in wealth. They didn't have the position in society, but they certainly had the money. Going back to the 11th century, Assisi develops a strong relationship with France. It's interesting, huh? Here you have the city of Assisi making this bond with France, and it becomes a trade route with France. Pietro Bernardone and his father will become a great merchants dealing and selling with the French fabrics. So Francis's grandfather was one of those men who was a serf, who began to enter into the merchant trade with his son Pietro, and they opened up this business with France in order to import to Assisi fabrics, and then they were able to sell those fabrics to anyone around. Now Assisi is on a direct road from Rome up and through if you head into France. So why go all the way to France when you can stop in Assisi and pick up your stuff? So they became very wealthy from trading that cloth. So let's go back now. Emperor Frederick I, he wanted to subdue Italy to himself. So in 1173, he captured Assisi. People were forced back into serfdom, and a rebellion was building. Okay, so you had, again, Assisi having to rebel because they're trying to push these people back into serfdom, and they're not going to settle for it. You know, Assisi does not settle for that. They don't like that, the Assisians. They're going to fight back. They want their freedom. So in 1182, 3 days following the Epiphany octave, a violent storm struck Italy. Francis is born either 1181, 1182. So Francis is either a few months old or he is a year old. And this terrible storm strikes Italy. It killed many men and many animals, this storm. It caused a great famine that lasted 5 years. So it lasted throughout the entire infancy of St. Francis. In July of that year of 1181 or 1182 is when Pietro Bernardone left for Champagne, France, to trade cloth when his son Francis was born. Okay, so I want you to look at that culture that Francis is growing up in. He's growing up in a city that's ancient of days. It goes back before Christianity. And his city was conquered by Christianity in a good way. Paganism was conquered by Christianity. And it was done so by the blood of the martyrs. And so faith was very alive in that city. And they were a rebellious people that didn't settle for being conquered. They were constantly being conquered, but constantly seeking their freedom. When they tried to push them back into serfdom, they fought back. And so Francis grows up with these stories, with this history, surrounded by, talking about these things. I mean, his father and his grandfather would have talked about having had been serfs and how they had to break out of serfdom to enter into this merchant class and become businessmen and make their wealth. So they were not stupid men. They were pretty brilliant and pretty brave to do what they did. Now Francis is going to be a recipient of their wealth. They worked hard to build the business, and he kind of sits back and enjoys what they bestow upon him. And Francis doesn't mind enjoying it. They don't mind bestowing it upon him because they're showing to everybody around them, hey, look how rich we are. Look how good it is. Look at our son and grandson. Ain't he grand? Look how well-dressed he is. Look how well-fed he is. Look how happy he is with all the money. Aren't we good? Aren't we wealthy? There was a certain social status that was there. But, there was still going on a certain amount of cultural, social status that the merchants weren't able to rise to. As I mentioned earlier, you had the noble lords, and you had this feudal system. Then you had these once serfs that are now merchants. They're equal in their wealth, but they're not equal in social status. This is why St. Francis will want to become a knight so he can become a feudal lord, and they could rise in the social status. That's why his father Pietro is so supportive of his son becoming this knight who's going to fight and is going to go out there and become this lord, so they can go from being simply wealthy merchants to becoming feudal lords themselves. Now, that'll never happen, but that's the desire. And so, in our next segment, we'll talk about the social and religious climate in the time of St. Francis. May God bless you, and may it keep you.